Chair of the Select Committee, Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I echo the relief expressed by the Honourable Member for Blackpool about the uprating decision. I'm pleased to follow his speech, but I wanted just to begin with some points about the way we uprate benefits and to echo some of the important points made by the Honourable Member for Amber Valley in his contribution. I very much appreciate the contribution he makes to the work of the Select Committee, because we know that legacy benefits are going to be claimed by some people until at least now 2028. And in our report last July, the Select Committee called on the Department to improve its IT systems and increase the speed with which changes can be made to legacy benefit and state pension rates, and it's disappointing. There seems to be no progress in doing that. Annual uprating based on the previous September's inflation is perfectly reasonable when inflation is stable, but it's not reasonable in the current volatile circumstances. We called, and the Honourable Member echoed this call, for a shorter gap between the inflation reference period and the uprating date, preferably using inflation data from the previous quarter or possibly more recent data still. And in the past year, that lag has caused real hardship. Benefits were uprated last April by the inflation rate the previous September, which was 3.1%. By the time that uprating took effect, inflation was nearly 10%, and the result has been benefits at the lowest real terms level for 40 years, and a big surge in demand at food banks. So I do, like the Honourable Member for Blackpool, applaud the fact that the Government is honouring its obligations this year and that there will be this uprating of 10% in time for the new financial year. That should prevent things becoming substantially worse for many in the coming year. But it's not going to make things much better. Trussell Trust Food Banks gave out 1.3 million food parcels in April to September last year, more than in any previous 6-month period, and 50% more than before the pandemic. At the Liaison Committee in December, the Prime Minister said he was going to, quote, work very hard to deliver lower food bank demand by the end of the Parliament. I warmly welcome his adoption of that goal, but it will only be achieved if social security support is increased in real terms. What is the right level for the social security safety net? The Working Pensions Committee plans to launch, and the Honourable Member for Amber Valley talked about this subject as well. We plan to launch in the near future an inquiry on the adequacy of benefit levels. It seems to me the level is now so low that inadequacy of the safety net is damaging the economic recovery. It's too low to do its job properly.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee for giving way, and he quoted some really damning statistics from the Trussell Trust there. Now, the inquiry that the Honourable Member for Blackpool North and Cleveland's mentioned of the APPG for food banks has demonstrated that when the £20 uplift was in place for universal credit, that food bank use did go down for all that it's increasing overall. Does he agree with me that we should be looking at that?
I absolutely agree with her, and that is the one point when food bank demand fell, and of course it went straight back up again once the £20 was removed. But I think the level of the safety net now is just too low to do its job properly from the standpoint of economic efficiency. People are being forced to accept unsuitable jobs with no prospect of training or advancement simply in order to subsist. And it's one of the reasons the UK's productivity record is so poor. We're not going to deliver economic growth until we tackle that productivity failing. There's interesting cross-party thinking underway on this at the moment. For example, in the Poverty Strategy Commission set up and chaired by the Noble Baroness Stroud, and our inquiry will be able to draw on that and other work. It is clear, I think, that the immediately preceding administration, the interim government, as the Honourable Member for Blackpool referred to it, would not have honoured those obligations. The former Prime Minister told us yesterday that her administration was brought down by a left-wing conspiracy in the financial markets. Not clear whether she regards my right honourable friend, the member for Hayes and Harlington, as having been responsible for organising that. But actually, of course, it was brought down by economic reality. I knew I'd get that. But I don't think that administration would have delivered an inflation uprating, and it is to the credit of the current administration that it has done so. I also welcome the increase in the level of the benefit cap. That cap was introduced in 2013, then it was reduced in 2016, and it's never been increased at all. Thank goodness it finally will be at the beginning of April, but only by the overall rate of benefit uprating, which means in effect that it is a standstill increase. It means the impact of the benefit cap won't get worse in the coming year, but it won't affect the worsening impact of the cap falling in real terms every year since it was introduced. I'll give way to him.
Would you go one step further in joining those of us that wanted the benefit cap scrapped in its entirely, rather than just being raised but actually scrapped because it's having such a detrimental impact on families all across these islands?
I think there is a strong case for that. At the time it was introduced, we were told it was to prevent people from receiving more in benefits than if they'd been working. But any relationship with the level of wages has long since disappeared. And the Child Poverty Action Group, in its briefing for this debate, makes the point that the increase doesn't undo the damage from the cap having been frozen since 2016, but that, quote, it pushes families who would be in poverty anyway into even deeper poverty. They point out that 123,000 households are currently affected by the cap, including 107,000 households with children, and it's one of the reasons why, before the pandemic, when the data was most recently updated, there were 700,000 more children in poverty than in 2010. I think the case for the cap does need to be reconsidered. I want to pick up the points that made by my honourable friend, the member for Westminster North, in her opening speech about the absence of uprating to local housing allowance, because that is a very big problem. It's going to be frozen for the coming year at the level it was set in 2020, even though rents are rising fast. I raised this as well with the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee in December, and he replied that the uprating in 2020 had represented, quote, a very significant cash uplift at the time, which it is appropriate to have maintained, echoing the wording that my honourable friend on the front bench quoted from the ministerial statement. I will give way. Yeah.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for giving way, and I agree with what he's saying about the rapid increase in particularly private sector rents, and it's huge in the big cities. Does he also think that the government should at least reflect on the need for a freeze on private sector rents and some serious legislation to protect what is now a huge proportion of our country's population who live in the private rented sector?
Well, I think he's making a very powerful argument that the rate at which rents are now rising is really devastating household finances in many parts of the country. All the increase in 2020 did, this much vaunted generous uplift, was to raise local housing allowance back to the level at which it had been set at the beginning of the decade at the 30th percentile of local rents. That is, it was raised up to a level where it covered 3 in 10 of the homes of that size in each local area. So it wasn't enough, even in 2020, to cover the rent for 7 out of 10 of the homes available. And since then, and by the end of the coming financial year, it will have been frozen for 4 full years. Since then, it has been frozen. The consequences of that are becoming clear. Last week, the Combined Homelessness and Information Network reported a 21% rise in the number sleeping rough in London in October. That's October to December 2022, compared to the same period in the previous year, up to 3,570, 29% increase in the number of new rough sleepers. The Chief Executive of Crisis said, and I quote, "It is simply disgraceful that the numbers of people forced to sleep on the capital streets is very nearly back to the record levels we were seeing before the pandemic." Zoopla shows large shortfalls for the cheapest properties by the end of last year. £2,630 a year shortfall for a one-bedroomed home in Southwark, which was almost doubled in a 5-month period. £3,555 shortfall for a 3-bedroom home in Bromley. That's an increase of over £1,000 from 5 months before. At the start of 2022, more than 1 in 3 renters in the private rental sector, 1.7 million people, were dependent on housing support to help them with their rent. Fewer than 1 in 12 private homes listed last year were affordable within the local housing allowance level, and this number reduced by 1/3 in just 5 months last year. And now the level of support is being frozen in cash terms for a further year. Crisis said last week, and I quote, "It was particularly concerned that the lack of social housing and the growing gap between overheating rents and the frozen local housing allowance is pushing people towards homelessness." That is the reality of the impact of this policy. It should be urgently reconsidered. Ministers say they're committed to ending rough sleeping, but this policy is driving an increase in rough sleeping. I'm grateful to my honourable friend on the front bench for drawing attention to the Select Committee's recommendation about the cap on the level of childcare support in universal credit. It's regrettable there's nothing here to address that. I'm hoping that perhaps in the budget there might be something on that front, given the level of cross-party concern about the inadequacy of childcare support at the time when we want to encourage people back into work. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a relief that this catch-up rating is being delivered to the main rates of benefit, but we are a very, very long way from providing an adequate social security safety net, and a large-scale repair job is going to be needed in the near future. There's growing evidence that disabled people, and the Honourable Member for Blackpool was right to draw attention to this, are facing an especially tough time in the current cost of living crisis, and their situation is going to have to be addressed. But I do most immediately urge the Minister to have another look at the level of local housing allowance. Ministers say they're committed to eradicating rough sleeping. It doesn't look as though they mean it. Keeping local housing allowance frozen for a 4th year will drive a further surge in the number of rough sleepers, as well as very serious problems for hundreds of thousands of others.